It began with a student's shovel and a dry season that never seemed to end. Under the sun-baked earth of an abandoned outpost, a volunteer crew pried open a sealed trapdoor and found, beneath decades of dust, brittle boxes tied with faded string. Inside were over 200 handwritten letters, pages penned between 1943 and 1961 by African soldiers who had marched, bled, and sometimes died under a foreign flag in Europe and North Africa. None of those letters had ever reached home. They were addressed to mothers, wives, children, lovers, names called against the distance of war that never answered back. When Ibrahim Traoré saw the envelopes, he did not summon a press corps. He flew to the site without fanfare and read through the night. After hours of silence, he spoke one sentence that would set everything in motion. If these words were once silenced, then the world must finally hear them. Within a week, the letters were made public, digitized, and translated into multiple languages. The platform that carried them, titled The Lost Voice, gave the world access to names, handwriting, and the human ache behind sterile military records. Reactions were immediate and messy. French officials issued cautious statements. Some corporations quietly paused projects in Ouagadougou. Yet ordinary people responded in another key. Grandchildren in Lyon and Marseille found photographs and notes among attic boxes, and the discovery became intimate rather than merely political. A woman in Marseille opened a letter her father had kept folded for 70 years and found inside a photograph of an African soldier standing beside a French child. She called a Burkina journalist with trembling fingers. "My grandmother spoke of a man who saved us," she said. "I never knew he was African." These small, private reckonings reframed the public debate. What began as archival curiosity turned into a human reunion. In living rooms from Ouagadougou to Paris, people traced the loops of a rushed signature and whispered the names the letters held. Students in Burkina Faso's capital began reading the pages each night on local radio. History classes replaced a unit of dry dates with a week of storytelling. Men long thought invisible produced tarnished medals, kept in drawers, remembering the uniform they once wore in silence. At first, diplomats warned that selective remembrance risked inflaming bilateral ties. An advisor fretted that Traoré might be weaponizing history. He did not. Instead, he used what he had found to insist on a different kind of remedy: recognition. He directed his national archives to release related records, invited scholars and descendants to collaborate on translations, and proposed an international program to return letters where possible to families and to memorialize names publicly, not as a political demand, but as an act of restoration. France, caught between national pride and private guilt, replied with a cautious envoy and one handwritten note: "We are listening." That small response opened a space where something deeper could happen. University historians found omissions in official rosters. Local museums dusted off boxes of rolled documents that suddenly matched names in Traoré's archive. A retired French pilot remembered escorting African units through North Africa. A curator in a provincial museum wept on air when match records and burial rolls surfaced. Public recognition spread not through grand apologies but through human reconnections. A photograph reproduced in a newspaper. A student-led march in Paris where demonstrators carried enlarged copies of the letters. A granddaughter of a former general acknowledging on television that her family's story rested on invisible sacrifice. In Ouagadougou, Traoré convened a gathering unlike any diplomatic summit. No flags, no podiums, no political declarations. He called it a meeting of memory. Descendants, veterans, historians, and students gathered on the same ground where the letters had been unearthed. He spoke plainly. This is not a contest of histories, but a reclamation of names. Let these letters return home. Let their voices be read aloud. Let their children learn the names that were stolen from them. The summit's aim was narrow and fierce, to restore dignity through remembrance. The ceremony unfolded with rare, unscripted intimacy. Traoré walked to the center of the assembly alone, unaccompanied and without formal entourage, carrying a simple cloth bundle containing 3 letters from men who never came back. He read slowly, the cadence measured like a prayer, a private pleading that his children remember him. A short line about freezing nights in Alsace, a broken sentence wishing his mother to forgive him if he did not return. The crowd fell into a hush that felt less like silence than the sound of collective listening. A French descendant stepped forward, holding a yellowed photograph, an image that matched one of the letters, and embraced a Burkina woman who had come to the summit seeking her grandfather's name. No banners were raised, no speeches were made. Names were simply spoken aloud, and in that act a history shifted. The effect was not confined to a single ceremony. Across Burkina Faso, classrooms now display lists of names where before there were only dates. In a Normandy cemetery, a group of students from Ouagadougou stood solemn before unmarked graves, reading aloud passages that once ended in silence. In French universities, new courses were proposed about the colonial troops whose roles had been minimized or erased. Small museums opened newly annotated exhibits. Families in Europe sent scrapbooks and photographs. Villages in West Africa produced oral histories long suppressed by survival's necessity. The letters became threads pulling the past into the present. Traoré refused to turn the discovery into a diplomatic cudgel. He explicitly declined demands for reparations or theatrical rebukes. Instead, he proposed practical, humane steps. Return the letters to descendants where possible. Digitize and archive them under UNESCO's Memory of the World program. Create joint memorial spaces in both countries. And launch educational initiatives so that children learn names before they learn dates. His message was simple and radical in its restraint. We do not seek vengeance. We ask only for truth and for space to grieve in our own names. The summit's ripple effects were unpredictable and profound. In Europe, ordinary citizens stepped forward with family artifacts, letters, medals, blurred photographs, to stitch together interrupted stories. In West Africa, elders retrieved medals kept in secret and handed them back to communities for public reburial. A teacher painted 50 recovered names on a school wall in a small settlement. Children learned to read those names as part of their lessons in history and identity. A museum director in Lyon opened war archives that matched lists in Traoré's collection, and footage of the matching records aired on national radio to an unexpectedly emotional reception. This was not a geopolitical victory. It was, instead, a moral and cultural reclaiming, an exercise in what we might call narrative sovereignty. The power of the act lay not in punishing another nation, but in restoring a people's right to their own stories. Traoré's leadership in that moment looked less like statecraft and more like stewardship. He used state instruments not to coerce, but to unseal memory. He refused to make history a bargaining chip. He made it an offering. The letters themselves were simple and devastating. A soldier asking if his village still stood, a medic writing of hands stained with blood and denied entrance to the officer's tent because of skin, a young man telling his sister to live boldly, and a father promising to return with a small gift if fate allowed. In every line there was tenderness, fear, and ordinary longing, the things archives rarely show. Hearing those voices changed public language. Newspapers that once referred to colonial contingents now printed names on the front page. Radio stations read letters each night, and families listened, sometimes in tears. That slow, persistent reading remade grief into collective memory. Traoré's gamble was to transform silence into ritual. The summit ended without treaties or press releases, but its aftermath altered classrooms, museums, and family albums. A modest plaque was installed at the foot of the outpost where the letters were found. Here, silence was broken. Here, names returned. No governmental seal claimed victory. Instead, communities reclaimed lineage. The most striking outcome was quiet. People began speaking the forgotten names at kitchen tables, in markets, and at the bedside of elders who had kept their medals hidden. The act of naming proved restorative. Across the globe, movements stirred. In Latin America and Asia, groups began to recover oral histories of laborers and conscripts whose stories had been overwritten. The simple idea that the past includes the voices of those who served without recognition resonated. Traoré's intervention offered a model for reckoning that did not demand retribution. Remembrance, he suggested, is itself a kind of justice. This was not the end of complicated politics. Some officials fretted that reopening wounds would reopen old grievances. Some editors misread the summit as provocation, but the dominant narrative that held sway was different. Here was a leader who used a discovery not to inflame, but to heal, a country that chose to listen, descendants who found names they could finally say aloud. The letters remained, of course, fragments of longer lives. Yet, by placing them in the public record, translated, archived, and read, the world had to reckon with a simple truth. History is not only written by victors, it is also stitched by those who were overlooked. In the end, the victory was small and enormous at once. A student in Ouagadougou memorized a name and recited it to his class. A museum in Lyon dedicated a wing to African regiments. A daughter in Marseille placed a framed letter on her mantle. And in the quiet between these acts, something fundamental shifted. The right to be remembered was reclaimed. Traoré never demanded medals or reparations. He asked only for recognition, for space to grieve, and for names to be heard. That modest demand, respect for memory, proved to be one of the most powerful acts of leadership the continent had seen in years. Because when the forgotten finally speak, silence stops being a weapon. It becomes a wound healed by words. And when a nation refuses to let its lost soldiers remain anonymous, it rediscovers its own humanity.